In the 16th century, 3 Portuguese castaways arrived on a beach during a storm, thinking they were going to die. But when they were rescued by local fishermen, they actually discovered an entire civilization, becoming the first Europeans to arrive in Japan. And with that discovery, in just a few years, the Portuguese would overcome the distrust of the Chinese emperor and the Japanese daimyos, and even naval battles against samurai, establishing themselves as an indispensable part of trade in the Far East. That's because it was the only navy capable of sailing those seas freely, without fear of the Ronin pirates that plagued the region. In today's video, we're going to dive into the little-known history of the Portuguese in Japan and understand how Portugal reached the region, and how many habits, words, and even aspects of contemporary Japanese culture were actually brought by the Portuguese. To understand how the Portuguese arrived in Japan, we first need to understand what Portugal was like at the beginning of the 16th century. With only 1 million inhabitants, Portugal had become one of the greatest maritime powers in the world. After Vasco da Gama discovered the sea route to India in 1498, the Portuguese built a vast commercial empire that stretched from Brazil to the Far East. In 1511, the Portuguese conquered Malacca, one of the largest commercial centers in Southeast Asia, where they traded spices, silk, gold, and porcelain. And in 1513, they arrived in China for the first time. From Malacca, many Portuguese traders began to hear stories from Chinese and Malay merchants about mysterious islands to the east of China. Populous, powerful islands completely unknown to Europeans? However, the initial Portuguese focus was to maintain and establish trade with the wealthy Chinese Empire. Thus, taking advantage of the illegal trade in southern China, the Portuguese in 1513 settled in Macau, in what is now Hong Kong. And, despite initial misunderstandings with the Chinese emperor, the Portuguese managed to reach Macau and establish permanent trade in several Chinese cities. Thus, it was from this trade that they began to explore the region more and more. In 1542, they sighted the island of Formosa for the first time, discovering Taiwan. But trade with Japan would, curiously, take shape by pure chance. In September 1543, 3 Portuguese men named Antonio da Mota, Francisco Zé Moto, and Antonio Peixoto were aboard a Chinese junk bound for the Chinese city of Ningpo. But a violent storm completely diverted the vessel, throwing it onto the island of Tanegashima, south of Kyushu. And there, the castaways were welcomed by the local inhabitants. The Portuguese soon realized that they were facing a different civilization. Likewise, the Japanese quickly noticed the novelties these merchant ships brought, many unlike anything they had ever seen before. And so by chance, trade with Japan became a firm priority in Portugal's Eastern Empire, and it started to be carefully planned. The Portuguese found in Japan a highly developed, organized, and culturally rich civilization. And the Jesuit missionary Francisco Xavier, who would arrive in the country in 1549, was particularly impressed with what he saw, describing the Japanese as a disciplined, proud, and deeply honorable people. Their intellectual abilities, which also impressed him. And the Portuguese seemed to have arrived at the right time. Japan and China at that time were not maintaining trade relations. And to make matters worse, all those seas were plagued by the Waku pirates, of Japanese origin, most of them Ronin, who invaded ships and spread terror from Japan all the way to the Philippines. But since the Portuguese had large, heavily armed ships, they were able to trade in the region without fear of the pirates. But what really impressed and amazed the Japanese was a very special object brought by the Portuguese, the Arquebus. That's because this rudimentary firearm would completely revolutionize the Japanese battlefield. Before the Portuguese arrived, the Japanese used weapons like the naginata, the famous katana, spears like the yari, or asymmetrical bows like the yumi. However, no matter how beautiful those weapons were, the arquebus represented a huge technological leap in the world of Japanese weaponry. That's because, while it had an incredible impact and greater range, it was a relatively easy weapon to use. The arquebus was so effective and simple, much like becoming a member of this channel and getting perks and exclusive videos if you love all things Japanese. Firearms arrived at a time when power was being contested in every corner of the archipelago. Japan was going through the Sengoku period, an era of civil wars between feudal lords called daimyos. And these weapons, extremely useful at that time, came to be called Tanegashima, in honor of the island where the first contact with the Portuguese took place. And they radically transformed Japanese military tactics, even directly influencing the unification of the country decades later. In this way, trade between the two peoples flourished quickly. The Japanese could acquire Chinese goods such as silk and porcelain without negotiating directly with China, even though relations remained tense. And the Portuguese, in turn, gained access to silver, copper, swords, spears, and kimonos. For a while, it was a system that worked very well, as Portuguese prestige grew in Japan not only as good traders, but also as good warriors. A memorable episode was the Battle of Fukuda Bay, where a flotilla of hundreds of samurai boarded 10 junks and more than 60 support vessels, commanded by the daimyo Matsuro Takanobu. And this fleet aimed to attack 2 Portuguese merchant ships for bringing firearms to their rivals. But the 2 Portuguese ships unleashed gunpowder and cannonballs and easily defeated the samurai and their daimyo, with only 8 casualties on the Portuguese side compared to more than 70 dead and 200 wounded on the samurai side. And so, Portuguese prestige grew day by day in the region. In fact, the importance of this Portuguese role led the Chinese in 1557 to allow the Portuguese to establish a permanent trading post in Macau, almost like a sovereign territory. That's because Macau became not only a trading post for commerce with Japan, but also an important base for fighting piracy. And since the Jesuits who went to Japan would first pass through Macau, later during the reign of Philip II, the Portuguese called that city the City of the Name of God in China. That's because Macau became a Jesuit outpost for the expansion of Christianity, both in China and in Japan. But, interestingly, the greatest symbol of the importance of Portuguese trade would come from a simple fishing village that the Portuguese would turn into a metropolis, the village of Nagasaki. In 1571, the area was ceded by the daimyo Omura Sumitada, who had just converted to Christianity and was about to adopt the name Bartholomew. And Nagasaki became something truly unusual in the history of the Portuguese Empire. That's because it was the only sovereign territory administered directly by the Society of Jesus, besides being Portugal's furthest outpost in the Far East. Every year, the Japanese would watch as a gigantic black ship appeared on the horizon, coming from Macau. And, according to historian Charles Boxer, until 1618 this ship, called Amacon, sailed from Macau to Nagasaki, carrying goods, merchants, and missionaries. And, along with trade, the Portuguese also brought Christianity. The Jesuit missionaries, starting with Francisco Xavier, in 1549 spread the faith with surprising success. And was the Jesuit method in Japan the same as the one that had worked in other parts of the empire? Adapting to the local culture, learning the language, and gaining the trust of the elites? Did Francisco Xavier himself learn Japanese and dedicate himself to understanding the customs of the archipelago before he started preaching? Is that because the Jesuits liked to use the main characteristics of the people to spread the gospel? And in Japan, the result was surprising. Xavier was even received by nobles and daimyos, something unusual for a foreign missionary. And in just a few decades, it is estimated that the number of Christians in Japan reached 300,000, a religious transformation of enormous scale in a society that had never had contact with the Christian world. And what's interesting in this sense is that the Portuguese presence in Japan, even though it was short-lived, left deep marks on Japanese culture and vocabulary. Portuguese words were incorporated into modern Japanese and are still used today. For example, the words pan, botan, vidro, and tobacco are part of everyday Japanese life, even centuries after the Portuguese left. In the same way, veludo or card games, which the Japanese call karuta. The same goes for the words irmã, irmão, Jesus, ombo, ombro, chabão, sabão, choro, choro, and capitão. That's because they refer to objects or customs introduced by the Portuguese. And tempura, which is a symbol of Japanese cuisine all over the world, was adapted from a frying technique introduced by the Portuguese themselves. The name comes from the Latin quatuor anni tempora, called temporas, referring to the periods of fasting in the Catholic tradition when vegetables and fish were fried. The Japanese, seeing the Portuguese frying, incorporated the technique. They refined it and turned it into something completely their own. And of all the techniques and introductions into Japanese culture, it was firearms that played a decisive role in the very unification of Japan, especially during the Tokugawa shogunate. Without the Portuguese arquebuses, the political history of the archipelago would have been completely different. But all this history would carry a dark side with it. That's because if the construction of this trading post was glorious, leaving it would be brutal and would leave even deeper marks than the arrival itself. All the glory of Portuguese Japan would end in a tragic way with isolation, martyrdom, and mistakes that would call into question not only the Portuguese dominance in Japan, but Christianity itself in that region. But that's a topic for the next videos here on the channel. So, if you like Iberian history, subscribe right now and become a member here on the channel. That way, you'll be able to dive deeper and learn even more about the fascinating Iberian history.